Okay. Face and the eyes are still... Eyes is just weird. Like... Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to try this glaze. How do you soften up the skin? Glazes? Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you right now. You definitely can use glazes. I'm just a big fan of areas like the skin of not using a traditional brush because a pointed round brush like this is just really, it's a very definitive stroke and it's really hard to hide. Like, you know, like when you see, like, let me get a nice, all right, this is a skin tone. Here we go. When you see that, should show up. There we go. When you see that on a model, it's just hard to hide, you know. We can make it a little darker here, you know. That's a hard stroke to hide. You know, so we've come up with all these kinds of ways of glazing and everything. Whereas if you take something like this, which is a rosemary smush brush. I'm watching the live feed because it's kind of weird talking to the whatever. Let me see, rosemary smush brush. Okay, so if you take something like a rosemary smush brush, I should not watch the live feed. That doesn't work well. If you take something like a rosemary smush brush and that has not a traditional point to it, what you're going to find is it's going to be a lot easier to do things like you can do that, and then you kind of blend it in, and you can see we do that, then we kind of, you can see it's a lot easier to make these transitions because we're just dabbing it. We're just, it's honestly, it's just a heck of a lot easier. And sometimes you go back and forth a little bit, you know, but you're not fighting the shape of the brush. So, so this is a Rosemary & Co. Smush brush. This is the small size. I didn't use the small size for a long time. I only used the medium size. They also have a large one that I don't think I've ever used. It's just huge. These are just great brushes if you're covering any kind of area. And the smaller you get it on skin and stuff, the less you have to worry about those harsh transitions. When you get down to like a 28mm face, like, see if I've got one here that I can pull up. I don't have one handy. You know, if I was painting this, like, you just don't have to be as precise with the blends as you do an area like this. You know, very obviously you're going to be able to get away with a lot more on her. The blends just don't have to be as good because the area is so much smaller. So most of the time in a case like this, you can do glazes, but the answer is usually very, very small steps. What happens is the brighter you go with a color, and skin tones have some very bright tones in them, the brighter you go with a color, the more white is in it. And white is super opaque, okay? So white covers everything else. So the reason that you don't get smooth layers as you tend to highlight, and one of the first things people tend to highlight is skin. The reason is because of that opaqueness. On the reason people go dark so easily, because you can get such smooth darks, is because a lot of the darks are very transparent. Browns, dark reds, dark purples, anything dark, a lot of times is very transparent, and so when you go to make layers with it, it just naturally creates gradients. So what happens is, let's put it this way, if I was going to, do I have a pencil? I've got, there we go. Yeah. So if I was going to, I got to do this. Where we go? All right, here we go. So if this represents your, shadows, your mid, and your high. Okay. All right. So if that's your shadows, your mid, and your high, you know, you might start out with something. Grab a brush here. You might start out with something like this, right? And then you're gonna move up to something like this, right? And then you're gonna grab, oh, that's a highlight. And then you're gonna grab your mid-tone, throw some more of that down. Okay. And then you're gonna throw some of your mid-tone down, right? And then you want to put some of your highlight, right? And then this is where we want to get, right? So if we want to go from there to there, we've got to take, right, what I'm doing there is wet blending. If you can wet blend, it's a lot easier. Okay, but that's what we're trying to get, right? The problem is when you do this in layers, when you're painting it layer by layer by layer by layer, it can be really daunting because what needs to happen is, where's my pencil? There it is. Okay, so what needs to happen when you're doing pencils, like this section might be a layer, this section might be a layer, this section might be a layer, and then when you get up to here, what happens is you really need to do like this. Like this. There's like so many more layers on this end when you're doing highlights than there is on this end because of the opaqueness. We get away with a lot down here because of transparency. We get away with a little more in here. It's probably more like that. And then down here we get away with like nothing. Like every single brush stroke starts to show. So you've got to take smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller steps on your layers. So it's something that is not immediately obvious and you almost never see talked about. But if you think about it like this, that once you hit just past your first highlight on your thing, if you want to get higher highlights on that, you got to go very small layers, very small steps. Unless you wet blend or airbrush or any technique that isn't traditional layering. But if you're doing traditional layering, you got to go, the brighter you get, the more you've got to do that. All right, I'm going to do one more thing and then I'm going to call it a night. I'm